Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 136, Mrs. Livesey, Part 1. Ethel Livesey was a serial fraudster and confidence trickster who became a media sensation after she ran out on her society wedding in 1945 and was later arrested for obtaining goods by false pretences. She was an attractive young woman from a respectable middle-class family in Manchester, but she had over 40 aliases, a lot of which were based on the names of movie stars. She had 9 official marriages, 4 children and 5 divorces. Her story stretches from industrial England to the French Riviera, from Ireland to New York, Shanghai, New Zealand, the Isle of Man, and across Australia. Ethel claimed that she was a cotton heiress, a wartime nurse, a casino hostess, a stowaway, an artist, an opera singer, gambler, spy, a close friend of the king, an air raid warden, a charity queen, and even the wife of Australian Test cricketer Jack Fingleton. Ethel Livesey was born Florence Elizabeth Ethel Swindles, quite ironic when you hear the details of her life story. She was born on the 24th of September 1897 in Manchester, England. Her father was Frank Arthur Swindles and her mother was Elizabeth Gertrude Taylor. Her parents married in 1901, so nearly 4 years after her birth, and her father was listed as a commercial buyer in all raw food, cotton, soap and tallow. She had a younger sister, Mabel, who was born in 1908. In 1915, at the age of 18, she married Alexander Charles Carter at Chorlton, Lancashire. Alexander was 5 years older than her. He was a stationer who worked with his father in their business. He went to World War I, and just before their child was born, he was pronounced missing in action, presumed dead, in November 1916. Florence was able to access Alexander's pay by using a ring paper which was given to the dependents of soldiers serving overseas. Instead of helping out with expenses, she was living with her in-laws at the time, Ethel spent the money on clothes and partying. Their son, Frank Alexander Carter, whom she named after her father, was born on the 26th of November 1916 in South Manchester, Lancashire. She refused to care for the baby. When Alexander was reported missing, Ethel took to her bed, and one night she slipped out of the house and disappeared and never saw her son again. By 1921, Florence and Alexander had got a divorce. In the 1921 census, when young Frank was 4 years old, he was living with his father, Alexander Charles, a traveller for paper stationery, now a divorcee, and his paternal grandparents Alexander and Charlotte Carter, and his aunts Doris and Gladys. Alexander married again in 1922 to Maud Hodgetts in Salford, Lancashire, and they had a son, David Victor, in February 1926. On the 16th of March 1939, young Frank joined the Royal Artillery, 90th Field Regiment, when he was 22, and he died on the 19th of July 1943 in Sicily, Italy, aged only 26. He had risen to captain in the Royal Artillery, and his death records show that he was the son of Alexander C. Carter and Ethel Carter, a nephew to Doris Robertson of Eccles, Lancashire. Doris was left the proceeds of his will, and Alexander Carter died in 1965 at Blackpool, Lancashire, aged 73. Why did Florence and Alexander divorce? Well, when Florence left her young son with her parents, she met Billy Tanner at the Black Horse Railway Station at Rainhill. He was a married returned soldier and takes her to the pub, and they agree to say that they are married and live together at the pub. The landlady discovers their lie, which would have been scandalous at the time. The police are called and they're charged with providing false information to an innkeeper and also fraud. In court, she was able to spin a tale to get off without conviction, but Billy, however, got 6 months jail. Ethel convinced the magistrate that she had been taken advantage of when ill and plied with drink. Her second husband was Ray Ward, and she met him at Blackpool and married him in Blackpool on the 30th of December 1916. He was also a soldier, and she married him bigamously. As it turned out, Alec wasn't dead. She then decided to write to her father, and her father then informs her that her first husband has returned from the war. She soon had 2 ring papers to draw on after meeting Ray, as he was on active service. She successfully juggled her 2 identities for a while. Florence also made the practice of deceiving shopkeepers into giving her credit. She was attractive, well-spoken and confident. However, she was charged with obtaining goods with false pretences. She was jailed, and Ray Ward's father actually had to bail her out. She left as soon as she was released, and Ray died in 1918 in France. Ethel then stowed away on a cruise ship and attached herself to a vice-regal party by claiming to be an opera singer, and pretended that she'd entertained the Duke and Duchess of Windsor on the French Riviera, and also claimed at this time to have been connected to the famous Coates Cotton family. She then married Alfred Spurgis in England on the 14th of November 1918, husband number 3. She then meets Captain William Norman Thornton Giblet, an Australian man who'd been fighting in the Western Front when he was waiting for a ship to return home. They married, but she used the name Daphne Pollard, who was an actress at the time, and this became husband number 4, and she came with him to Australia in 1919. She was with him for nearly 3 years. Her husband came across letters that she'd written to her father, and he then discovered her true name and that she was already married, so he sought a divorce. And it was in the paper on the 6th of June 1924, Giblet versus Carter. William Norman Giblet petitioned that his marriage with Florence Elizabeth Ethel Carter, falsely called Daphne Gilbert, should be declared null and void on the grounds that at the time of the marriage, the respondent's lawful husband, Alexander Charles Carter, was alive. The petitioner and the respondent went through a marriage ceremony in January 1919 at Warminster, County of Wilts, England, in a registry office. His Honour granted a nullity decree to be declared absolute in 6 months. And in the Mirror in Perth on the 7th of June 1924, an article titled A Mix-Up in Love Affair. In Sydney, the matrimonial adventures of Florence Ethel Carter, otherwise known as Florence Elizabeth Ethel Swindles, or Daphne Pollard, or Mrs. Giblet, a prepossessing woman, were unfolded to Justice Owen in the divorce court yesterday. William Norman Giblet, now post officer at Thoralea, was in 1918 in England as a captain in the 55th Battalion of the AIF at Warminster. He met Daphne Pollard on the 25th of January 1919, and he married her and brought her to Australia. Time passed happily until one day Giblet's suspicions were aroused by a writing on a piece of blotting paper which his wife had used while writing a letter to England. Inquiries were made with surprising results. Only 9 days before her marriage with Captain Giblet, she was a respondent in a divorce suit brought by Alexander Charles Carter, who secured against her a decree nisi, which naturally had not been made absolute before the second marriage. So Captain Giblet, early in 1923, started his petition in Sydney for the nullity of his marriage, and while this suit was waiting, a hearing of another man appeared. He was M.S. Horne of Belmore, who applied for and secured from the court an order for information as to the petition of Giblet. His ground for request being that he'd married the same girl in May 1923, but in his affidavit to the court he spelt the name Swindles. Today Giblet secured the necessary order for nullity. So Florence used the name Daphne Vivian Pollard in her marriage to Midford Horne in May 1923. They divorced in May 1937 and he married in 1943. And on the 19th of April 1923, a small article stated, "Very gay was the prenuptial party given by Mrs. Jack Solomons at Farmers on Thursday afternoon in honour of Miss D. Pollard, whose marriage with the Captain M.S. Horne will take place during May." Florence then returned to England and married George Addie Anderson in Dublin in March 1924, before her divorce was finalised to Gilbert or Horne. George had been born in Sydney in 1884. He was 40 and Florence 27 when they married. On the 12th of June 1908, at the age of 23, George moved to New York. He stated he was single and had recently been in Aberdeen, Scotland, and his uncle lived in the US. He was naturalised as a US citizen on the 4th of January 1912 in Texas. In November 1923, George sailed from New Zealand to San Francisco, and he stated at that time he was married and was staying for 4 months in America before going to England. There was a Nettie Dora Anderson who sailed from New York to Southampton, England on the 14th of December 1923, and family trees have her as George Addy's wife. George and Florence must have married very quickly. They had 2 sons, Frank George and Basil William. On the 17th of March 1927, Florence departed London for Sydney with her 2 boys. The shipping records said that they had been staying at 57 Atwood Road, Disbury in Manchester. However, then she married William Lloyd Thompson using her maiden name in Lancashire, England in July 1928. So where were the boys? Well, it was recorded that in 1930 in Adelaide, she would leave the boys, that were only 6 and 5 at the time, for days at a time, leaving a shilling on the table for every day that she planned to be absent. One day, she just didn't come back. It was during the Depression, and the neighbours had to look after the boys until they were placed into care. In 1946, there was a statement made by Florence saying that since her arrival in Adelaide, Mrs. Livesey said she'd paid the Children's Welfare Department more than £300 for the maintenance of her 2 sons, who had been put into state care about 1933. And she was trying to contact her boys, so she came out to Adelaide in August 1945 from England. She also stated in 1946 that some years ago I even disguised myself as a nun and came to Adelaide, going from school to school to find my boys. George Addy Anderson, the boys' father, was living in Bank Place, Melbourne in 1953 and was working as a bank clerk, and he died in July 1955 at the age of 70 in Melbourne. So as Florence stated, she came out and put their boys in state care in Adelaide in 1933. In the Adelaide News on the 16th of November 1933, there was an article stating, "A woman faces fraud charges, a man's amazing court story, alleged offer of £5,000. An amazing story of offers made to him by a woman customer of £1,000 and a shop in New Zealand, a guaranteed position in England with travelling expenses paid, and that she would settle £5,000 on him, was told in the Adelaide Police Court today by the manager of a drapery store at Henley Beach. Florence Elizabeth Ethel Gardner, aged 33, of Henley Beach, a well-dressed brunette with big brown eyes, was charged with having between October the 26th and November the 3rd at Henley Beach obtained from Coles and Hughes drapers goods to the value of £7 by means of false pretences that she was a station owner from New South Wales and that her present husband was a member of the firm Sar Good Gardner Drapers of Sydney. Eric Francis Thompson, manager of Coles and Hughes, said that Mrs. Gardner called at his shop on the 16th of October and said, "I am Mrs. Gardner from New South Wales. We are station owners. My husband has had a nervous breakdown and we have taken a furnished house at Henley Beach." She told him that she would be wanting some drapery and asked whether it would be convenient for her to open an account. He replied, "We don't run many accounts, but we make them out on the 1st of each month." She said, "Do you do business with Sar Good Gardner of Melbourne and Sydney?" The witness said that he told her that he had done a little. Mrs. Gardner then told him that her husband was one of the firm of Sar Good Gardner. He took her to one of his assistants and said that it would be all right for her to supply Mrs. Gardner with goods. On the 1st of November, Thompson said he received a letter from Mrs. Gardner. He went to the South Australian Hotel and he had a long conversation with her in the lounge, and she said to him, "I expect you wonder why I wish to see you." He said he did and gave her her account, which she said she would take home and check with the dockets. She would get her husband to write out a cheque for the £7 on the following day. No payment has yet been received by him. The witness detailed a conversation he had with Mrs. Gardner in the hotel lounge. She said, "I have been thinking of all of your trouble," which he had confided in her about his worries on the 16th of October. She said, "I feel that I would like to make you very happy. Are you in duty bound to stay in your present position?" And he replied, "No." And she said, "If I offered you £1,000 and a shop in New Zealand, would you care to go over there and start a business on your own?" The witness replied, "Why do you make this offer to me?" And she said, "Because I think you are an honest man and I would like to make you happy." He said, "What do you expect in return? I'm only a poor man." She said, "I expect nothing in return, only to see you happy." Mrs. Gardner said, "My father is the director of a large cotton factory in England and my mother was one of the Coateses, the cotton people. If I offered you your expenses to England and guaranteed you a position with my father for 2 years, would you accept it?" I said, "Why do you offer this to me?" She said, "Because I like you." Thompson said that he might suggest to her that her father might not be suited by him, and there were millions out of work now. He asked her if she would care to have dinner with him, and she said yes, her time was her own. He paid for a cocktail and dinner. On returning to the lounge, said Thompson, she told him she was not happy with her husband and would see him when he liked. On leaving Mrs. Gardner, he arranged to meet her on the following Tuesday to give her his answer about going to England. He was asked, "Didn't you tell her you were anxious to leave Australia?" And he said, "No, that is a lie." Thompson denied that he had any hopes of advancement from Mrs. Gardner in another position. He was not looking for another position. I treated the whole conversation there as a joke. I thought she was a most unusual woman. I could not get the gist of the woman. I had my wits about me concerning her as soon as the first offer was made. I was astounded at the offers she made to a man who was an absolute stranger to her. "Did you have any regard for Mrs. Gardner?" And Thompson said none whatsoever. Mrs. Gardner had told him she would settle £5,000 on him. And he was asked, "Did you think it would come off?" And Thompson said, "I absolutely didn't think it would come off." Then Mr. Ollison asked the witness if he'd asked Mrs. Gardner to stay at the Grosvenor with him, and he said, "No, that is a lie." He was then asked, "Were you at the end of the conversation convinced that Mrs. Gardner was not what she pretended to be?" And Thompson said, "That impression was in my mind." Clarice Lizzie Ann Clemson of St Vincent Street, Port Adelaide, said that she had met Mrs. Gardner in August. Mrs. Gardner asked her if she was married, and she said, "Yes, my husband and I are looking for a married couple's job." The witness said that Mrs. Gardner told her she owned a station in Queensland and would get the two of them a situation there. And under the name of Florence Elizabeth Ethel Gardner, she was charged under the warrant with having failed to appear in the Adelaide Criminal Sessions on the 7th of December 1933 to answer the charge of obtaining goods by false pretences. In the Port Pirie Recorder in South Australia on the 11th of June 1934, so 7 months after she had gone to court, it says, "Society lady, opening new accounts and passing bad cheques." The remarkable ease with which an attractive-looking woman claimed to be a society lady can open accounts and get valueless cheques cashed by Melbourne tradespeople was instanced in the Court of General Sessions when Florence Elizabeth Ethel Anderson, 36 years old, of Ballarat, who was charged under the name of Gloria Gray, pleaded guilty before Judge Wanarski to 10 charges of having obtained money and goods by false pretences. She admitted previous convictions for false pretences. Her method was to say that she was in society and would bring the business people the custom of Melbourne's best people. She succeeded in opening accounts and cashing cheques and then quickly disappearing. She said she'd been a nurse in the war and married a captain in the army who died shortly afterwards. Then she married again and had 2 children. The man deserted her and came to Australia. She followed him only to find that he was a bigamist. The man blackmailed her by saying that she had known she was party to a bigamist marriage. The council contended that the tradespeople were as much to blame of giving her credit as she was to blame for having passing the cheques. It was what was known as a screw system. His Honour said he never ceased to wonder at the credulity of tradespeople in the city who accepted good appearances and manners and who were ready to give credit and cash cheques without first making proper inquiries. It was the duty of the court to prevent tradespeople from being exploited. In a few weeks, this woman had obtained by fraud £65 in money and goods to an even greater value. She would be sentenced in all to imprisonment for 6 months. His Honour refused a request that the sentence be served in a convent. Then after her jail term, she pops up in Brisbane. It says, a case of a woman that was charged in Brisbane in 1935 under the name of Florence Elizabeth Ethel Gardner with the aliases of Anderson, McEwen, Lady Betty Balfour. Betty Balfour was an actress at the time, so another borrowed alias from a famous actress. And the name by which she was once best known, Gloria Gray. She told Mr. C.R. Noyes something of her misfortunes when she pleaded guilty to a charge of passing a valueless cheque valued at £5 in January 1935 and obtained 4 hats from Nancy Steinhouse's millinery salon in Edward Street, Brisbane. Mrs. Gardner stated that she had come to Brisbane 3 weeks prior, so either at the end of 1934 or the start of 1935, and she had committed other offences of a similar nature. All my offences were brought about by the man I was living with. He told me that if I cashed the cheques and gave him the money, he would get my children for me from the welfare home in Adelaide. I paid the welfare department in Adelaide £385 for my children. I'm only earning £2 a week at present, and if you give me a chance, I'll pay the money back. The prosecutor told the police that she'd been living with a man who was cruel to her. She had left him in Brisbane, and she said she went to Sydney and then New Zealand and then on to England and then returned to Australia. So there is in fact a record of Florence using her name as Ethel marrying William Alexander Corradine in Rotorua, New Zealand on the 27th of February 1935. William was Scottish and was an able seaman in the Royal Engineers and was 15 years older than Ethel. They returned to England and they had a daughter, Ethel May Corradine, in England on the 22nd of September 1936. However, her daughter died as an infant. William Corradine was living in Truro, Cornwall, and listed as a retired civil engineer in 1939. Ethel is listed, but she had Ethel Livesey written in brackets as a correction. So this is the first time that we see her next alias as Livesey pop up. William died in Hardhorn, Lancashire, England on the 15th of October 1943 at the age of 61. She then spent time on the Isle of Man with a man called Thomas Livesey, and she changed her name by deed poll as his wife would not divorce him. She convinced him to put all of his assets in her name so that his wife couldn't access them, and then walked out taking everything with her. In July 1945, she arrived in Adelaide from the Isle of Man with £40,000, equivalent to around $2.2 million today, telling everyone that she was a cotton heiress. She also said that she had £2,000 to her credit in the Bank of New South Wales in Adelaide. It also stated that in 1944 she had 2 blocks of flats in Liverpool, England, which were sold for £6,000 that actually belonged to Thomas Livesey, and he had transferred them to her under a deed of gift. She also owned 5 houses, 3 of which have been sold since she came to Australia. By August 1945, she'd arrived in Sydney's wealthy eastern suburbs. She was a larger-than-life character who enjoyed the good things in life and delighted in entertaining. The Sun newspaper published a piece on her hospitality towards Australian and American servicemen while she was living in Britain. It says, "Hostess to Aussies at Manx Home." Former Globetrotter Mrs. Ethel Livesey has started her travels again and has arrived in Australia. She has come to see her sons, Lieutenant Frank Livesey RN and Squadron Leader Basil Livesey RAF, now in Adelaide, and to meet the families of hundreds of servicemen she entertained at her homes in the Isle of Man and in Wales. Mrs. Livesey will stay here for 6 months and then hopes to fly home via America, where she has invitations from families of US servicemen she entertained during the war to visit every part of the country. And that was on the 30th of September 1945. On the 23rd of October 1945, it mentions Mrs. Livesey in terms of the Hotel Australia, which was one of her favourite venues. Tables massed with red roses decorated the ballroom of the Hotel Australia last night when Mrs. E. Livesey of Edgecliff gave a dance there. Among her guests were Sir Frederick and Lady French, Dr. and Mrs. Geoffrey Maitland, Mr. G. Fletcher, Mr. and Mrs. Roger Hardwick, Flight Lieutenant and Mrs. Sharp, Dr. and Mrs. Cunningham, Mrs. Alfred White of Adelaide, and many naval officers. On the 10th of December 1945, it mentions in the Sydney Truth how in London her sister was interviewed. Woman unable to say how many times sister married. In London, interviewed today, one of Mrs. Livesey's married sisters, who withheld her name, said, "I frankly don't know how many times my sister has been married. It may be 4 or 5 times or even more. I know she's had the names of Corradine, Anderson and Livesey, and I believe there's been others." Mrs. Livesey's father, Mr. Frank Swindle, well known in the Lancashire cotton industry, is now an old man. Mrs. Livesey's last address in this country was Brindewin, Montgomeryshire, which she rented from Mr. Robert Carey Chappell Gill, former High Sheriff and Director of Lloyd's Bank. Mrs. Livesey rented Brindewin for some months before the end of last year, and since then I have not heard of her except that I understand she has gone to Australia. She is a jolly woman, fond of getting about. She had a house at the same time in the Isle of Man, which I understand was also rented. I know little about her private affairs. So there's only one sister that is recorded on family trees, and that's Mabel, who was 11 years younger than her. So this has got to be Mabel that has reported that small amount of information. Then on the 11th of December 1945, it says it is understood that solicitors in Australia are interested in Mrs. Livesey on behalf of a well-to-do landowner on the Isle of Man. Police have been given to understand that Mrs. Livesey arrived in Australia from the Isle of Man only a few months ago and passed through Adelaide about the middle of August. And then it mentions Mr. John Swindle, the father of Mrs. Ethel Livesey. His, in fact, real name is Frank. And it says that he lives at the House Drake Hotel just outside of Douglas on the Isle of Man. The Daily Mirror's London representative found him yesterday in his bedroom at the hotel where he's recovering from a serious illness. He said, "I don't know what all this fuss is concerning my daughter. Whatever it is, you can talk to her in Australia. I don't wish to say anything. I don't want to get mixed up in it." Mr. Swindle said that he visited his daughter's house, Ivy Dean, in what is called Little Switzerland in the district of Douglas. Before she left, she told me she was returning shortly, but now I read this, indicating a recent news report from Sydney. Inquiries in London revealed that Mrs. Livesey always entertained lavishly when living on the Isle of Man and once gave an elegant garden party. Mrs. Livesey came to Australia on a Swedish vessel on a priority, which she got through Australia House in London. There were only 12 passengers on the boat when it sailed. An official of Australia House who interviewed Mrs. Livesey said that she told him she'd gone to Australia with her husband in 1919. After his death, she'd married again in New Zealand in 1935 and had returned to Britain in 1938, leaving 2 boys at Geelong Grammar School. The officer said that Mrs. Livesey also told him that one of the boys later joined the Navy and the other enlisted in the RAAF. She added that her second husband died in England in 1943 and she wanted to return to Australia to see her boys. The Swindles family is described by the Daily Mirror's London staff as a big cotton family and one of the largest and wealthiest of the families in Lancashire. The family does a big trade with Australia, but Mrs. Livesey's father is not related. On the 11th of December 1945, an article stating change name. Police say Mrs. Livesey took the name of Livesey by deed poll before coming to Australia. When the woman arrived in Adelaide, she had dealings with a city bank in connection with a remittance from overseas. Police are now satisfied that she has the money. The sale of an estate is believed to have brought her £5,000 and shares valued at between £30,000 and £40,000 that have been said to be acquired by her. Mrs. Livesey stayed at a leading hotel here for several nights and then left for Melbourne. Mrs. Livesey travelled to Melbourne by plane. She was the heaviest woman that the A&A booking clerk had ever weighed in. She weighed 275 pounds, at just under 20 stone. And then a report from Sydney said Mrs. Livesey is believed to be in Melbourne or Tasmania. Several of her Sydney friends stated last night that Mrs. Livesey intended to take a plane in Melbourne for Tasmania. Mrs. Livesey had hired a car in Sydney, intending to join the Melbourne Express at Mossvale, but later changed her plans, drove on to Goulburn, and there she was said to have paid a car driver £50 for a trip to Melbourne. Ethel settled herself into a flat at Cumberland Court, Edgecliff. Word went around that she was a cotton manufacturing heiress, and within a few months she was well and truly part of the Sydney social scene, and she became acquainted with everyone of note in the city. She told her new friends that her husband had died during the London Blitz and that her 2 sons had served in the war. There was a great surprise when the middle-aged Ethel suddenly announced that she was to marry James Rex Beach, a civil servant with the Treasury Department. This was in fact to be her 9th wedding. The ceremony was to be held on the 8th of December at the fashionable All Saints Church at Wallara. She was to be given away by another fast-tracked friend, Sir Frederick French. He was the former Commodore of the P&O shipping line. No expense was to be spared with the floral decorations within the church, and it was arranged that a flock of doves would be released when she said "I do." The honeymoon was to be spent at the luxurious Carrington Hotel at Katoomba in the Blue Mountains. It was reported that Mrs. Livesey had stated that she and Mr. Beach expected to return to England in March by way of Monte Carlo, where she had a chateau. Her home in Britain was said to be at Brindewin Hall, Montgomeryshire in Wales. That was what the father was referring to, that she had intended to move back over there with her new husband. And it also says Mrs. Livesey is the elder daughter of Mr. Frank Swindles, British cotton magnate, came to Australia 4 months ago. Her bridegroom, Mr. James Rex Beach, is the son of Mr. James Beach of Staffordshire, England, and is an officer with the Sub-Treasury Department. Soon plans had grown to such proportions that the bride-to-be had to hire a housekeeper and a private secretary, Miss Joyce Derry. However, on the 16th of December 1945, there was an article titled Wedding Day Worries. On the morning of the wedding, it was announced that the bride was becoming stressed and ill due to the glare of publicity. Her secretary, Derry, said that her employer's marriage in All Saints would be replaced by a quiet ceremony at the Darling Point residence of Dr. W.D. Cunningham, Ethel's physician. The doctor said he only really knew Mrs. Livesey as a patient, but he'd offered the use of his home because he felt sorry for her. As many guests as possible were contacted and asked to bypass the exchange of vows and go straight to the reception. In the Blue Mountains, the couple's reservation was changed to a best room instead of a bridal suite. Meanwhile, preparations continued and the bride and her attendants assembled for a group photo. In a rapid elevation from secretary to personal friend, the bridesmaid was Joyce Derry. Mrs. Cunningham, the doctor's wife, was also drafted as one of the 3 maidens of honour. The flower girl was a 7-year-old Marigold des Arnolds, and she was to carry Ethel's 36-diamond wedding ring on a satin cushion. And there was splendid Ethel, photographed alone in an orchid pink wedding dress. It was created by the French designer Molyneux and had flown in from Paris. Rare orchids made up her bouquet and corsage. The lavish reception at Hotel Australia had unlimited champagne laid on for 500 guests, and the centrepiece was a spectacular 4-tier wedding cake. 2 hours before the 6 p.m. wedding, the groom turned up at Ethel's flat, accompanied by Roy MacDonald, a barrister. Roy had seen her cheating at cards and wondered why. He made inquiries in England and discovered that Mrs. Livesey was never married to a Mr. Livesey, and she had a criminal past. The South Australian case from 1933 was also still open. A lengthy chat ensued before Mr. Beach and his legal man, and apparently Ethel promptly collapsed, took off her dress and went to bed. The marriage was off just as the limousines were pulling up outside the flat. There was disappointment and embarrassment for the would-be attendants. They shielded their faces from waiting photographers as they left the home. James Beach had discovered that his bride was not the person he or anyone else believed her to be. Meanwhile, a huge crowd of onlookers had gathered outside the Hotel Australia, and when the bridal party failed to arrive, they felt let down. They chanted, "Where is the bride?" instead of "Here comes the bride." The invited guests began to arrive in evening gowns and dinner suits, only to be told that the bride had become too unwell to go through the marriage. On the 9th of December in the Sun, it said Mrs. Livesey, who weighs almost 20 stone, was said to be suffering from a severe attack of arthritis in the legs. Mr. Johnson, the hotel's head caterer, announced that Mrs. Livesey wished the reception to go ahead. The unlimited champagne had been cancelled, but the cake remained uncut, and after some initial awkwardness, the party began. 18 waiters filled plates with expensive delicacies and cocktails, and liqueurs were served. Some couples even took to the dance floor. The well-known singer Jean Hatton was originally booked to sing at the wedding, so she entertained guests. Mr. Johnson probably regretted allowing the reception to continue, as it turned out that his wife had lent the charming Mrs. Livesey £500, so the reception was on him. At 6:30 the following morning, the jilted bride left her flat with 6 suitcases and a hatbox in tow. Word leaked out that Sydney society and her intended husband had been duped by a serial imposter. Over the years, she'd used so many names it was hard to keep track of them. Gardner and Livesey were just 2 of the more recent ones. On the 16th of December 1945 in the Daily Telegraph, it says wedding gifts presented a problem. To find suitable presents for Mrs. Livesey, some of the guests had scoured the shops in the weeks before the wedding. They wanted mostly Venetian glass, said to be collected by the bride. But when they heard the price of the only good Venetian glass available in Sydney, up to £6 for just one wine glass, they jibbed and turned to crystal instead. Most popular selections were decanters, wine and sherry glasses, pieces of fine china. Said a Castlereagh Street dealer, many of the guests were obviously buying above their pockets because they knew the bride was wealthy. One said to me, "She's used to the best. I don't want anything cheap." When the wedding was called off, people were stuck with the presents and tried to sell them back to the dealers. Few were successful because of the widespread strike at the time. People were out of work and were selling pieces of china and crystal to stay afloat in a market described as the worst since the second year of the war. And part of the articles looking into who this mystery woman was on the 16th of December 1945, where it says police have been told that an officer of the railway department in Brisbane issued a ticket to a woman who greatly resembles Mrs. Livesey on Friday morning. She wished to travel to Mackay on the Sunshine Express. In the meantime, James has gone to court to achieve some justice. Poor James Beach had been lucky to escape Ethel's clutches, but his troubles were by no means over. She had the cheek to sue him for a breach of promise, claiming that £10,000 no less for hurt feelings and money spent on the cancelled wedding. Beach countered by saying Mrs. Livesey was not the moral woman she purported to be. He'd been informed of her adulterous relationship with a James Livesey in London, and then there were a litany of lies about her financial circumstances, such as her claim of owning a string of properties, including a chateau at Monte Carlo and a manor in Wales. As for owning a luxury yacht on which she insisted she'd entertain the Duke of Windsor, that was complete nonsense. He did win the case in the end, but only after a lot of trouble. On the 26th of December 1945, it said that Mrs. Livesey was remanded on a false pretences charge, and she left the Sydney Police Court with her solicitor. She answered the charge as Florence Elizabeth Ethel Gardner. So, authorities in Adelaide demanded Mrs. Livesey face the charges of false pretences and larceny dating back to 1933, and she had some harsh words for her former pals in Sydney when she arrived there. And on the 10th of January 1946, it shows her coming off the plane, and it says Mrs. Livesey expects a fair deal in South Australia. I'm sure the people of Adelaide are more charitably disposed than many fair weather friends who took advantage of my hospitality in Sydney. All I ask is for a fair deal. There was a Sinner Sound newsreel that was shown in cinemas around Australia that Ethel paid for in the aftermath of the abandoned wedding. The newsreel features Ethel proclaiming her innocence and pleading for an understanding in her troubles. And the title of it is Ethel Livesey Tells Her Story. And it starts off with an editorial, and it says, believing that fair play is still an important, even if fast-dying tenet of the democratic faith, this newsreel has made space available to Mrs. Ethel Livesey to tell her own story. What she has to say is presented exactly as she recorded it.
I have taken this opportunity to speak to the public through this medium, because what I have to say cannot be turned maliciously against me or distorted. I have suffered severely in the past few weeks through the publicity that has been given me, of which I have not sought. I have had many hard knocks in my life, but the hardest to bear has been the masterly inactivity of people whom I wanted their friendship most. Adversity brought me new friends, friends whom I know are sincere. They come from the mass who had sympathy for a woman who was undergoing a great trial, not the so-called Sydney society. I take this public opportunity as the only way I can to thank the innumerable people who have written to me. I have had more than 1,000 letters. A number of them have been offering me a home. To these people, I am eternally grateful. Their unselfish actions are a marked contrast to those who did not hesitate to accept my financial help, but who have now excluded me from their visiting list. I have had a varied life, and I have seen much suffering. I went through the Blitz and through the Battle of Britain. I was an air raid warden, and I have helped on many occasions to bring out the maimed and twisted bodies from the rubble. I am very proud to have been able to have done this, because I feel as an Englishwoman it was my duty to do so. Perhaps if some of those who have turned against me could have seen a little of the suffering that I have seen in this last 5 years of this dreadful war, they may have had a little more kindness to have shown to me in my trial. I am not ashamed of anything I have done, and I can look everybody in the face. I wonder if they could do the same.
So on that note, listening to the lady herself, the second part of this episode is taking you to Adelaide, where she has been called upon to answer to charges of fraud and what she got up to in different parts of Australia for the rest of her life. The second part will also outline what became of her children.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.